Aesthetics and Philosophy of Experience. In 2016, she organized in Rome the 9th Deleuze Studies International Conference, 11 to 13 July, and Deleuze Studies Camp between 4th to 8 July. Some of her books, published books, include Deleuze and the Concept of Cinema from Edinburgh University Press, Deleuze in Italy from Edinburgh University, and Aesthetica, Cinema, and Art and Cinema, and philosophical essays on Nespolo's Art and Cinema, among many others. I'm asking Professor Daniela to start now with
Thank you. Talk. Thank you so much. I want to thank, first of all, the organizer of this huge and interesting conference, Professor Subro Shah, Professor Paromita Mukherjee, and you all for your attention today. My talk will deal with the humanities and a new approach of humanities, that one of environmental humanities, and I'll try to propose a possible aesthetical perspective within the context of environmental humanities, and so the title Environmental Aesthetics. The spread of the coronavirus and I would say the entire the situation of the entire planet have made it clear that it is the moment to transform philosophy and humanities, to rethink philosophy and humanities, if philosophy and humanities don't want to abdicate their task to rethink, to think our present. Pandemics, extreme climatic events, great waves of migrations are all events that we all are experiencing here in Italy, both in Italy and in India and all over the world. And all these events remind us that the planet is going through a serious ecological crisis. I would say also that the periodical intergovernmental conferences seem to reproduce a sort of tired rituals with very, very little results. The urgency of this situation would suggest a political approach based on solidarity between people, based on internationalism, on solidarity between countries, generations, I would say also living species. On the contrary, there are alarming signs that we are going in an opposite direction. And yet, on the other hand, to be optimistic, not so pessimistic, we are also witnessing, especially among ordinary people, especially among young people, a wave of awareness that is emerging with a growing strength. So this time give us also the opportunity to rethink a lot of issues, to rethink the humanities, as the title of this conference proposes. Faced with a crisis of the environment that risks, above all, to be a crisis of humanity with consequences in our daily lives, culture and humanities must feel called directly into question. And it is precisely to reflect on these models that environmental humanities were born. they are practiced for about a decade in Anglo-Saxon countries above all. It is a wide and rapidly growing field of study, and it is based, I would say, on a sort of ménage à trois between humanities, social sciences, and environmental sciences. The aim is to shed light on the cultural dimension of this ecological crisis in an horizon that is both critical and creative. So the dialogue between literature, history, anthropology, philosophy, linguistics, cinema, arts, social science, natural science produces knowledge that not only serves to analyze such situation, but also to promote a different, a more inclusive, critical culture. It is therefore intrinsic in this cultural discourse a dimension of activism. In fact, and I would like to quote Deleuze here, but maybe it's not necessary to quote Deleuze for that today. Thinking does not only mean representing the world, representing life, but acting to transform them. Environmental humanities allow us to relate to the environment with a view that identifies responsibilities and values without losing sight of the carnality of the world, in which economic discourse and political decision take shape. I use this term carnality. I don't know if it is a correct term in English. I'm not an English native speaker, it's obvious, but I choose this term, maybe not so correct in this context, carnality, also to try to refer to Merleau-Ponty, La chair du monde, to stress the materialistic position of this approach. In this perspective, the environment ceases to be a passive and a neutral background for our actions and becomes a melting pot of dynamics that are actively intertwined with human events and lifestyle. This entanglement of human science help us to make up for the deficit of imagination that emerges when, as philosopher Rosi Braidotti writes, we find ourselves having to think the unthinkable. This is a quotation from Posthuman, the book by Braidotti. Events such as that of the coronavirus are so important as to challenge our representation. It's another quotation. It is clear how this widening of perspective, which extends to our relationship with technology, non-human world, pushes us to reformulate the very concept of humanities in a model that has rightly, in my opinion, been defined post-humanities, Braidotti also, or non-anthropocentric humanism. Non-anthropocentric humanism. I'm quoting a book by Serenella Iovino, Literary Ecology, a book published some years ago. So among the characteristics of this new approach, that one of the environmental humanities, non-anthropocentric humanities, I would like to highlight today the transdisciplinary or post-disciplinary aspect, or even the undisciplined stages of environmental humanities, as it has been recently defined by Marco Armiero in a recent text. This characteristic of the environmental humanities to be interdisciplinary, to be transdisciplinary, to to be undisciplined, highlights how a reflection on the ecologies of our life must necessarily take place outside the sectorial perimeters that are still in use in our universities. Professor Anki talked about this situation of the universities earlier. This is a problem inherent in the academic structures that often are unprepared to host transversal fields of study. At least in Italy, this huge conference today shows that maybe in India the situation is different. But all these explain the resistance of the academy in receiving new discourses, especially when they invest traditionally consolidated disciplines. In Italy now, there are just two initiatives about environmental humanities. One is a master in Venice, and another one is the postgraduate course that I coordinate with some colleagues. So very little, not sufficient situation where we can talk about this transversal field of thinking to produce choral thinking. If it's true that we are experiencing a crisis of imagination, then environmental humanities can have a particular relevant role. That of experimenting with forms of creativity, releasing narratives and promoting alternatives. In this sense, some minutes ago, I tried to propose a list of disciplines involved in the field of environmental humanities, anthropology, arts, cinema, linguistics, philosophy, and so on. But maybe to propose a closed list, it's impossible, because all forms of creativity and critical thinking dialogue with the environment. However, it is clear that the discourse of environmental humanities transcends the individual disciplines that compose them, and it becomes instead an original research practice capable of experimenting with contamination of languages, methods, and concepts. So, with their undisciplined status, environmental humanities respond to the challenges of the ecological crisis with what Armiero and Jovino, two Italian scholars that work, one in Sweden and Jovino in the States, have called a declaration of interdependence. So not a declaration of independence, but a declaration of interdependence. And I'm really impressed by the fact that earlier Professor Anki talked about this word, interdependence, a word used for proposing this thought, this thinking in common, interdependence. And interdependence not only between fields of study, but between doing and thinking, human and non-human, between apparently distant places, apparently distant times that have never been so close as today, in this particular moment and in these last years. Then why talk about aesthetics? Why talk about environmental aesthetics? How does a traditional and separated discipline fit into this context? I would like to quote a book by Ian Chambers. I think it's his latest book, Thinking with Migration, that states that thinking puts our education, our knowledge, what we believe we have acquired in crisis. Such sense of inadequacy is something that Professor Anki earlier described very accurately. And this is the key, this is the point. Even more at the root of this materialistic way of thinking, which puts the beginning of thought outside of philosophy, we can quote once more Deleuze, the idea that thinking the world does not mean representing it, but acting and transforming it. So the question about aesthetics becomes, how can we put in crisis aesthetics? How can we perturb it, as Chamber would say, perturb our knowledge, perturb our education, our formation? First answer, my first answer for today is with new imagery. First of all, talking about aesthetics and ecology at the same time means questioning the traditional paradigms through which we perceive and represent nature. Means questioning the idealization of the landscape, the environment and its harmony. This kind of idealization can lead us to think that the only solution is a return to the past. Therefore, it becomes desperate in cases where it is not possible to return back to the past. On the contrary, we have to abandon nostalgia, and it needs, in fact, learning to stay with the trouble of living. I'm quoting the subtitle of the book by Donna Haraway about Cthulhu-Sen. Learning to stay with the trouble of living, or finding life in capitalist ruins. It's another subtitle of the book by Anna Tsing, Mushrooms at the End of the World. The artistic narrative or an aesthetic philosophical perspective can then serve to show with different eyes the ways and effects of our daily habits. To look from the point of view of the animals, to look from the point of view of the entire earth, leads to the discovery that everyone is alien, foreigner for someone else, putting in crisis, for example, the paradigm of an asymmetrical relationship, so that the human would have control over the world, or even the ability to destroy the world. It's so central, anthropos, that we believe that we can destroy the world. Instead, we are experiencing today firsthand, I would say, when a virus, an invisible virus, invisible to our eyes, can do something very powerful. From this new look, new imageries can rise. I'm referring to some books by Appadurai, the idea of an imagery, a new social imagery. To imagine the relationship between the living, to propose new possibilities. Narration can do this not only by choosing certain topics, certain themes, but by proposing a new narrative dynamic that promotes the perception of a different look. In a context sometimes too apocalyptic, in which journalistic stories lead us to see only a dead end, a barred road, a new narrative that proposes new imaginaries can help to open new possibilities, not nostalgic, of restoring order and harmony, but rather of development and creative transformation of our life. Second answer, the question is, how can we perturb traditional aesthetics? Looking at the history of the aesthetics, going back to its birth in the middle of 18th century, we can see that the term aesthetic was literally invented by a German philosopher, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, who used the Greek noun, the Greek term aesthesis, which means sensation, sensitivity. In the course of its history, aesthetics has therefore concerned the arts, especially in Europe. What we must not forget that the arts are only one of the possible examples of experience, of sensible experience. Are only one of the possible examples of experience where the sensitive and bodily aspect is so important. We can think, for example, also to aesthetical experience of nature. Therefore, if ecology is the relationship of the human being with the environment, it is the relationship between sensitive bodies and environment. Aesthetics and ecology have always been related. I'm going to conclude with a third answer that I could title Undisciplined Discipline. This point is maybe more technical in a philosophical sense, but I believe it is interesting for our discussion today. And regarding once more the history and the birth of the aesthetics as discipline. At the birth of the term aesthetics, Baumgarten compares it to logic, the science of rational knowledge, taking up the epistemology of Leibniz. So we are going back to the 17th, 18th centuries. Leibniz had criticized Descartes and the Cartesian idea of identity between clear ideas and distinct ideas, where clarity means the possibility of recognizing a unitary content. Distinct ideas, means the possibility of enucleating individual parts within this content. Leibniz, against Descartes, argues instead that we can recognize that many themes form a unitary whole, but that the overlaps between these themes sometimes do not allow us to distinguish them from each other. That is, it is possible to recognize a whole, a unitary context, but well, for Baumgarten, the opposite of distinction, of distinct
Daniela,
ideas.
I'm going to interrupt a bit. Sorry about that. A request to all the participants, please mute yourselves. Please keep yourselves muted. Otherwise, there is too much disturbance. Kindly mute yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Daniela, please continue.
No, that's okay. Okay, so we are at the third answer of the question: how perturb traditional aesthetic to give a contribution in a aesthetical perspective to environmental humanities, a new approach of humanities, more inclusive and more interdisciplinary. My third answer is trying to going back to something that regards the history of aesthetics, 17th, 18th century, when Leibniz against Cartesio proposed the possibility of a field of knowledge in which is recognizable a unitary context of themes, of issues, but not the possibility to arrive at the analyticity of conceptual knowledge, because the overlaps between some themes not allows to distinguish them from each other. So there is a knowledge that is clear because it's recognizable, a unitary context, but it is not distinct. It is not analytical. It is not something that separates one form from another. For Baumgarten, the opposite, Baumgarten is the inventor of the name aesthetics. The opposite of distinction is not clarity, but is confusion, which means that there may exist clear and at the same time confused ideas, and these ideas are those of aesthetics, that is, of sensitive knowledge. So aesthetics shares with the environmental humanities, with the humanities that question its own status, shares with the environmental humanities a characteristic that seems at the beginning of the discipline unfortunate, and instead today we can feel the richness of the characteristic of confusion, which is not obscurity, that is the opposite of clarity, but the fortunate, the lucky, the fortunate impossibility of distinguish, of separating, of isolating themes from one another. What at the birth of aesthetics seemed an unfortunate circumstance, the impossibility of a separate analysis of the individual parts, of which Baumgarten tries to overturn the meaning, proposing a somewhat ambiguous definition, confused clarity, is perhaps what we need most today. Maybe the only way to rethink and transform the present is considering the questions of the present in their overlapping mixture, transdisciplinarity, undisciplinarity, using together, thinking in common, using together all the tools at our disposal at the cost of giving up the security of disciplinary boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for this wonderful talk. I was just thinking about one area, since you also are a very important thinker in the field of Deleuze studies. And since you're talking of Baumgarten and aesthetics, now I remember that Baumgarten also, the term also brings the association of perception, to perceive. And now to I think the word I think, to perceive, from where aesthetics also gets linked with. Now, if I talk of this concept of to perceive or perceiving as an act with sensory feelings and identification, the question of the body immediately gets directly linked with the, and that is where the question of, on the one hand, the famous debate on the idea and the corporeal, the matter. On the one hand, aesthetics as something to be perceived with the senses and experienced, and on the other hand, something which one thinks, one imagines one tries to have a grasp over the idea of aesthetics. So how do you talk about this bringing together of this huge hiatus, this huge debate, which is as old as Plato, and from early Greek philosophy onwards, it's continuing. And in Deleuze's time, Derrida, and like everyone, Foucault had, and then today also, as we are meeting this coronavirus question, again the question of what the body feels and what one thinks about the body. So in relation to your view of like the question of aesthetics, how would you address that in yeah.
Yes, thank you, Subra, for this important question, important and very difficult question. It's true that at its birth, aesthetics brings together many issues. The first one, going back to the etymology, aesthesis, is sensitivity, perception, sensitivity, sensitive experience. So the possibility of perceiving the world outside, but also the question of liberal arts, and also the issue of beauty. All these three directions, these three perspectives are in the very first definition of aesthetics by Baumgarten in the middle of 18th century. I think that today in Europe, in Italy, above all, a lot of philosophers talk about aesthetic as knowledge, sensitive knowledge, perception knowledge, something very basic that regards our bodies, first of all. I think that it is important instead to bring together this question of perception, really important, because we can go back the materialistic approach, the Deleuzian approach also, and the question, the issue of imagery, imagination, image. The idea of something that starts from a sensitive experience, but can transcend the it's not maybe a correct word, something that can develop this first very basic perception to new imaginaries, new possibilities. And in this context of environmental aesthetics, of environmental humanities, in this context of rethinking humanities, aesthetics, the aesthetical perspective can contribute with this materialistic approach, that is, thinking starts always with an encounter with the outside of philosophy. This is very Deleuzian. You know the books by Deleuze. I can see, and this is a very Deleuzian statement. And I started by Deleuze to go to environmental humanities because the idea is that philosophy, thought, any forms of creative thoughts doesn't start never as a sort of intellectual exercise, methodical, reflexive, but always starts from an encounter, sometimes violent, as this encounter with COVID today, an encounter that produces a very urgent need to think. So aesthetics is perception, science of perception, science of bodies, of sensitivity, in the sense of the starting is always from the world outside. I hope that I answered at least a little bit to your question, Subro.
Others from the plenary or keynote, if they want to ask something, they can ask directly from the plenaries and keynotes if there is any question or query. Okay. Okay, so then we have to move on to the next session, which is by Shaurit Bhattacharya. Thank you, Daniela. There is no question in the chat box also.
Everyone.
So thanks a lot. And it was like every session I have to I can understand the difficulties that were faced. So sorry and thank you for the patience and the way you